It is 5 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for everyone, for you guys joining us for this panel discussion, Black Print Culture. I would like to start this event off with a moment of silence. Let's remember those we have lost who are on the front lines of the global pandemic, for those on the front lines of the movement for Black lives, for those we have lost due to police brutality, and for all of our loved ones who have transitioned. My name is Vanessa Evers, and I'm a creator. Also, I'm the program manager for the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage. And Curtis Small is also joining me today as the co-moderator.
Let me unmute myself. I'm Curtis Small, and I am a librarian at the University of Delaware in the Special Collections Department. Very happy to be here today. I'm going to now introduce our participants. First, going alphabetically, is Dr. Jesse Erickson. Dr. Jesse Erickson is a bibliographer and researcher at the University of Delaware, where I work as well. He's in the library, special collections department, and the English department as an assistant professor. Dr. Erickson's primary research interests include ethnobibliography, African-American publishing and printing, and American Owidiana, that is, materials related to the 19th century writer Ouida. His most recent publication is entitled The Gentleman's Ghost, Patriarchal Eurocentric Legacies in Special Collections Design, which came out in the recent book Archives and Special Collections as Sites of Contestation, which came out this year. Next, Dr. Brenna Wynne Greer. She is an associate professor of history at Wellesley College. She's a historian of race, gender, and culture in 20th century US, with a focus on African-American business and visual culture. She is the author of the book Represented, The Black Image Makers Who Reimagined African-American Citizenship, which came out in 2019, last year. And she is currently at work on a second book, which examines the post-war development of Black commercial publishing and its significance within US culture and Black life. Finally, last but certainly not least, we have Amos Paul Kennedy, who I think it's safe to say that Amos is a revered letterpress printer. He has described himself, when I got a chance to meet him last year, as a community printer. He conducts workshops all over the country, including one that he did as part of the Black Bibliography Conference here at the University of Delaware last year. One way to learn more about Amos's wonderful life and work is to watch the documentary Proceed and Be Bold, which you can find on YouTube. So now Vanessa, I think, is going to give us the layout for the structure today.
Yes, and just a pause, actually. We moved very quickly through the moment of silence. And so I do want to actually acknowledge the moment of silence at this moment. All right, now we can go ahead and begin. The structure for this panel discussion, Curtis and I have provided the panelists with a couple of questions up front that all of the panelists are going to address. At 5:45, we'll begin a live chat, Q&A, where the audience members will put the questions that they have in the chat feature, and that will be enabled at 5:45. And I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first question. Each of you center multiple components of Black print culture in your own research and profession. Please share your thoughts on how your work challenges the traditional ideologies of bibliography and the ways that your work makes advancements in the field. And I'm going to call on Brenna, and then from there, we're just going to kind of go back and forth from folks answering the questions in kind of a conversational style.
Okay, first I want to thank you for even asking me to participate in this panel. My work, for those of you who don't know, which is probably many, work focuses on mid-20th century Black commercial magazines, and particularly those of the Johnson Publishing Company. And I didn't understand in doing my research that I was doing analytical bibliography until a colleague kept pressuring me to consider my research in that vein. And the publications that I work with are woefully studied as Black print culture. And I think that's for several reasons, but most of which is that they're mass produced, they're commercial, they're largely intended for entertainment purposes. And I think that there are prejudices about the people who consume them and the content in them, but I also think it speaks to the traditional ideas about rare books and book studies. And to the extent that, again, this is not something that I considered myself to be a part of, or the research that I was doing, it wasn't something that had been explained to me for the bulk of the time that I was doing this research. And I think that there are also systemic challenges for people who are doing this research, myself included, which I'd be happy to talk about later. But I've used these publications as material objects, particularly to trace business decisions that have given me evidence about Black consumerism, Black capitalism, advertising, consumer aspirations, and that in turn I've used to prop up arguments about consumerism or the role of consumerism within African-American citizenship quests. And I could not have done that without the material objects, so.
All right, thank you, Brenna. Jesse or Amos, would you guys like to answer that question?
I'll jump in. I've been doing bibliographic work and research since about 2007. I actually discovered descriptive bibliography in community college. And one thing that stood out to me, not immediately, but as I began to familiarize myself more with this process and these kinds of methods of research, is that it seems to me that the rationale for the copy text and for the ideal text led to sort of an obsession with collation among the 20th century bibliographers, right? But for my research, which really kind of looks at the intersection of how material components, book objects, inform the process of racial and ethnic identity construction, right? Other components such as binding and typography, and illustration and layout, and especially paratext are more important considerations, right? So I'm moving away from that comprehensive accounting bibliographically coded representations of the ideal or the copy text. And I'm moving toward a more strategic analysis of those components that are more relevant to the arguments that deal with the process of identity construction. To say that collation no longer has a place in the process, but it often just takes a backseat to other aspects of the book, which were not given previously not given the same amount of attention, in my opinion.
Well, my relationship with this whole thing is very mixed, because I go from let's just burn down all the libraries and blow them up. That way, the exclusion of my race will be complete, and it will be intentional by my race. Because when I started printing more than 30 years ago, I just did a little search on fine print books by Black people or about Black people, and you would swear that there were no Black people in the United States of America looking at this. And then when you look at the people who populate these professions, we are lacking there. Despite the fact that we have more than 100 historically Black colleges and universities, these universities and colleges have been deprived of the resources that they can engage in the type of research that larger institutions do. And I think that this is a crime against humanity because it is restricting the growth of humanity. To deny Black people is to deny all people. And so at some points in my career, I've been very bitter because I jokingly used to say that what is rarer in the 20th century than a Black man making a book by hand? And I found out that there's a lot of things rarer because it did not register with a lot of libraries that I took my books to and presented as like, here's what I'm doing. And at one point, it was personal, but then I took it as a race issue, as if to say, we will exclude you from our collections. And this is, I think that we're still fighting that. Not just Black people, but Indigenous people, even more so than Black people. Yeah.
I guess I'll jump in now with a question that follows on Vanessa's question. And look, we're going to have maybe a little bit of extra time because we're sort of ahead. But I'll throw this in there for the conversation. What thoughts would you like to share, all of you, about the distinct, Jesse started to get into this already. We're asking about the distinct features of African American print culture. If African American print culture or Black print culture is a thing, what is that thing, and how do you define it in terms of publishing, book production, printing, typography, the other aspects of print culture? So what is this thing, and how does it define itself, and what different understandings or methodologies would need to be brought to an understanding and a study of the past and the present of Black print culture? Jesse, since you've started to get into that, I think, in your last question explicitly, would you like to start off?
Sure. I really appreciate this question, and I should also echo my thanks for the invitation to participate in this really a wonderful panel. I have so much respect for my fellow panelists. It's great to be a part of this. But I think I'm a member of the hip hop generation, and I was schooled in jazz and R&B and blues. But as a member of the hip hop generation, I feel like I'm really interested in the material evidences of improvisation and the remix, right? Like freestyle and remix and sample culture, and I'm interested in sort of those elements of Black print culture and book production. So in terms of the materiality of Black print culture and its diasporic roots, coming from Africa, I think that, interestingly enough, like Robert Fraser in his post-colonial approach to book history, I think he was really close to understanding what folks like Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy elucidated about the complexities of Black cultural expression in their work. And I really think that, sort of there's like entirely different modalities of literacy practice, literary production involved here. And these are at stake when we look at Black cultural expression. We have to take them into account. So I think we really have to consider the context of each cultural and political movement coming out of the Black community that the books and ephemera are coming out of. And that includes everything from novels and poetry and monographs to the more quotidian objects like magazines and concert flyers and even like soul food restaurant menus. Like everything is on the table, right? And every single detail. So I really pay close attention to all those minor details.
Thank you.
I'll weigh in on that and say, I want to echo some of what Amos said. One of the things that I've struggled with is arguing that the materials that I work with are rare. They're rare books. They're worthy of preservation. They're worthy of study. And one of the things that I appreciate about Black print culture as a concept, let alone as a thing, is to echo Jesse, it's an expansive concept. And I think that's something that you can bring to the study of Black books, and that idea of a Black book is expansive. And, you know, for the materials that I work with, nobody's keeping them. Nobody's keeping them. So despite the fact that they're mass produced, they're considered to be pulp. People don't keep them. Libraries don't hold them. They discard them. Archives don't hold them. And so in a way, they really have become rare because they're undervalued. And that keeps me from being able to use them as a scholar. But I really think that it also, they're being denied the communities that produced them. And those communities aren't even being able to appreciate how important, not just as cultural pieces, but important in terms of, for me, again, as a historical source about, that has allowed me to open up the World War II and Cold War era in ways that I wouldn't have been able to do. And I just don't think that a lot of times the markets for these products and even the producers of them are allowed to experience or think about how unique and uniquely important these products are.
Well, I like to say that while race does play a factor in this, I think class plays an even greater factor in it. We live in a civilization where elitism is paramount, and therefore we will save the objects that are associated with the elites, while we destroy the objects that are associated with the masses. And I think that it's time that we flip this on its head, and we say it is the masses that actually make culture, and that we should celebrate the culture that they make at the beginning of the making of it. Because you will see that culture has a tendency to percolate up, not down. You can see this all the time, and especially in popular culture, and then eventually it makes it to the elite culture. I mean, you got Hamilton on Broadway. 40 years ago, if somebody said you're going to do hip hop on Broadway, they would probably have beaten you with a baseball bat, you know? So I think that for me, it is also a class issue. I think that we have to stop this exclusion, because you don't know what you're throwing away. You don't know if what you're throwing away will answer that question that you have, because it wasn't produced by this, say, magazine publisher as opposed to this one, or it wasn't produced by this printmaker as opposed to a poster maker. I mean, I take it really personal because I do posters, and posters, especially the kind of posters that I do, you know, people just throw them away because they were for an event and it's over with. And that's the way it's been for hundreds of years. But they have a culture and they have history in them that needs to be preserved and needs to be studied.
Thank y'all for your responses. I'm going to move into the next question, and definitely, like Curtis said, we will have some time for some extra questions of our own and from, of course, the audience. Some of you own your own business, and some work for Black-owned businesses or have worked for Black-owned businesses. During this time where there has been an overwhelming amount of statements from many companies standing in solidarity with those who are against state violence and racism, what ways do you think such statements help and or hurt the movement for Black lives? And also, there has been a call to support Black-owned businesses. How has your company been impacted by this call to action? Or if not company, but your work?
Well, I can speak to that. Fortunately, despite what Curtis said about me, I do run under the radar. So no corporations or NGOs have contacted me to do work for them. And I'm perfectly comfortable with that, because I prefer doing work for the masses. I think that I have lived long enough to see this happen before. I like to call it the popularization of the Negro. And it happens in waves. And if someone studied it, they could probably say, oh, the next one's going to be in 2072, you know. But in 68, there was this rush to put Black people out there. There was, you know, Time Magazine did a big issue. Back in the 40s or in the 20s, National Geographic did the New Negro, you know, bringing the Negro to the population. And so now we have, you know, what we got? We got Vogue doing something, and another magazine that's doing a big expose on Black folk because suddenly we're popular again.
Yeah, Vanity Fair.
Right. You know, and it's like, okay, this is great that you're doing this, but tell me, how many Black people, how many people of color are on your staff? When are you going to get an editor of color on your, as the editor? You know, if we're so good, if we're so popular right now, we're that way all the time. Why is it that, you know, like you just trot us out every 20 years and say, look, here the colored people, yay! You know, so that's my thought on it.
I'll weigh in there, and I was thinking about this question and reflecting or noting how cynical and I am, and perhaps particularly at this moment. But you know, I think financial support of Black businesses, Black communities, and Black movements, that's useful. That can be useful support, if not solidarity. What's happening right now, this wave of sudden, you know, expressing of support from particularly corporations, large corporations like Amazon or Netflix and Facebook. One, those statements are taking the form of, we see you and we support you and we feel your pain. And that, you know, that keeps, I guess, Black Lives Matter and the issue of racial justice at the forefront. But I also think that it undermines those movements and even the concepts, because they become brands, they become trendy, and I think it exposes, it makes racial justice or Black Lives Matter a currency. And so I agree with Amos. It's funny because I posted on my own Facebook the Vanity Fair issue, posted about it and said, you know, this makes me angry and I don't know why. And it was like crickets. So I knew that I was maybe on my own in that statement, but it was to what Amos is saying. You know, this is great. You know, featuring Breonna Taylor and, you know, having a guest editor, but it's because it's trendy right now. And so what does that mean in terms of, you know, I keep wondering, and I'm sure most people do, I keep wondering what happens when we're no longer in the midst of a pandemic and people have their, you know, usual distractions and activities available to them. And we're even seeing that now that there's, you know, that support is fading. And so, you know, obviously, I guess I would prefer that there were expressions of support, but
Brenna, we're not hearing. You may want to
rather
your camera.
In terms of, you know, that in the systems that are central is case.
Brenna, we lost you for your last couple of seconds, so I'd love to hear where you were going.
I was just saying that I find these to be, yeah, I was saying that I find these to be fairly empty, you know, empty statements, and just, you know, what one has to do to be in business right now.
So in sort of my philosophical approach to my own research, I've embraced sort of the hypermodern perspective. And in doing so, in tandem with my Afro-pessimistic understanding of the nature of society and how it operates, I have come to accept that we live in an era or an age that it's sort of capitalism run rampant, and that truth itself is defined by marketing and the brand. So then everything is sort of flattened in that way to be marketed or to be branded as such, right down to our own personas, the way that we brand ourselves through social media, right? So that's a hypermodernist interpretation. But I've conflicted with the question because it gets back to my own sort of experiences growing up as a young Black male in Los Angeles, and the years particularly that I spent in a place called the Antelope Valley, which had a sort of rampant white supremacist gangs running around at the time in the 90s. And these were, sort of bands of skinheads that were terrorizing Black folks in the community. And it makes me think, okay, do I prefer that kind of racism, right? The kind that's in your face and obvious for me to see, so then I can defend myself against it accordingly? Or am I willing to accept almost a more insidious form of racism that takes on a nice sort of neoliberal kind of smiling face and shaking of hands, right? That sort of invites you to be in white spaces, but doesn't fully include you, right? And so that's what I feel. That's how I feel when I see statements like these. It makes me grapple with those same questions because they are duplicitous in that sense. But is it that I prefer that lip service is at least being paid so that there's some level of accountability? Or do I prefer an alternative? And I'm thinking Jim Crow, right? Where we're outright excluded, the years of segregation where, we understood that we weren't welcome in these spaces and there was no question about it. And I don't know, obviously the extreme seems like, the worst example, but I felt myself, at least in sort of an Afro-pessimistic way, more adept at dealing with the racism that in my face that is clear as day, as opposed to the sort of the tiki torch marching racists that wear the khakis and the button downs, which if I saw them, in my day-to-day interactions, I would not know, immediately where they stood as I did with the skinheads that had the neo-Nazi tattoos and the steel-toe boots, which I can immediately identify as, a threat. So yeah, I mean, there's a level of superficiality to these statements that one has to discern and parse out. Mm-hmm. And even with the best intentions, right? I think the onus is on all of us to take up that challenge and to really try to begin to start to live out and realize what we're grappling with here when we make these kinds of statements, put them out. But essentially, I agree with the other panelists in that they are sort of signifiers of the times of this sort of intensely corporate environment we all find ourselves in.
Can I just add to that? Another aspect of this is that I think these statements allow consumers to think that they're participating in some sort of activism if they then start to, they make consumer choices that they go with one company or one product over another, and that activism, again, that's wholly, to my mind, wholly insufficient in terms of, actually realizing racial justice or, in terms of anti-racism. It gives, same as social media, it gives us a way to think that we're acting in behalf of Black Lives Matter or racial justice, where we're really just as consumers propping up a system, that, again, as I said, is anathema to anti-racism.
When a corporation actually loses money because they put social justice issues above the bottom line, then they are about the real thing.
All right.
Yes. So the question that I'm going to ask now is very related to what we've been talking about already, but it's also slightly more specific. I ask this question because in the years that I've been going to book fairs, and it's only been several years since I've been a librarian, and going to antiquarian book fairs, I've noticed that Black book dealers are not represented, and I mean not represented at all, at any of the major antiquarian book fairs in which African American materials are sold for ever increasing prices. I'm talking about books, manuscripts, ephemera, images, etc. Many of the major collecting institutions, including University of Delaware, that acquire items through these dealers at these fairs. Many of us acquire items through these dealers. And I'm wondering if you have, and none of them are Black, and very few of them are women as well, of any race. Do you have any thoughts about this situation of inequity, basically, and the possibility of more diverse representation among book dealers in the future?
I have thoughts because, again, speaking specifically to the materials that I work with, I have spent a lot of time and energy trying to find these magazines, which surprised me. And what I've noticed is that I haunt, eBay or flea markets, and collectors, white collectors, are starting to recognize a value to these magazines, kind of like under the umbrella of Black Americana. And that's how I'm being able to get a hold of them. But I've spent hundreds of dollars trying to amass a small collection for myself for research purposes. And because of that, I'm not inclined right now to share that collection with, say, the rare books collection at my own institution or at the rare books school, which I think is what needs to happen. I think that these items need to go into those repositories. But I also think part of what you're talking about, Curtis, is that, or what you're witnessing is what I myself as an academic who might feel more privilege or more access feel about my relationship to Black print culture. I have been made to feel that it's not as important. It wouldn't make me, I wouldn't consider myself, I wouldn't necessarily organize as a person of color, organize a profession around dealing in this material. And I think that's part of, perhaps to me, the most important thing is to promote the idea of Black print culture and promote it as something, again, unique and uniquely valuable, such that African Americans, Black people, want to deal in it and save it, and that people producing it recognize that they should start archiving it and saving it immediately, because other people aren't going to do that, or they're going to do it and they're going to fleece you for it. They're going to fleece you for it without a real value, without an understanding of the value.
I'll jump in next. So shout out to the Leimert Park and Crenshaw African American Book Fair that I used to go to every year when I lived in Crenshaw in Los Angeles. I always felt so comfortable there. And you know what? I'm just going to out myself with a guilty pleasure. I enjoy reading urban lit. And, that's okay. But, there's so much like self-publishing, Black publishing that you encounter in those spaces. And it's all black space. And, I just feel, I never felt uncomfortable in that environment, that kind of book fair. How, on the other hand, when it comes to antiquarian book fairs, I frequented antiquarian book fairs for, the better part of a decade or so. And I've had to learn to become, I'm never 100% comfortable there, but I've become more comfortable over the years. That I'm part of the community, I know more folks within that community. But, my first experiences there were pretty much almost scary. How I can definitely remember antiquarian book fairs where I was literally the only Black person in the room. And that it's definitely, it hasn't happened one time, I'll put it that way. But there's always been an allure to me in the antiquarian book trade. There's a certain elitism about it that is attractive on some level, right? But there's always that distance, right? So I struggle with that. So I actually, from the time that I pursued special collections librarianship, and I pursued it again in community college, going all the way up, the ranks, working as a what you call like a page or a messenger clerk in the library, and just working my way up. I dreamed of having my culture represented in these spaces, right? specifically, Black culture, the hip hop generation. And I wanted to see things like graffiti Black books and rhyme books, circulating in these spaces in the antiquarian book trade, right? And going back to like 2008, 2009, that was sort of a pipe dream. We were a long way from there at that time. But now I'm actually seeing that happen, right? And, it's almost like, be careful what you wish for, because it's jarring. It's jarring to me to see that, these traditionally white, these historically elitist spaces, to see representations of my culture being sold for these, ridiculous prices. I mean, I'll never forget one time I saw this photo album of Black and brown teens, just a regular photo album of Black and brown teens from around like the late 1980s or 1990s, around there, right? The time I grew up, and it was being sold in the market, and I was like, well, I've got one of these, like I got some of these, but I didn't understand why this was being circulated in this way. And I thought, what did these people maybe think? I don't know, they're possibly gang affiliated. I mean, I don't understand what's going on here, just like in terms of the style of dress, and then, they're hanging out at the park. So it made me wonder. I'm like, and now I'm seeing, things like Black books coming up on the market, and hip hop concert flyers from the 1980s coming out on the market, and they're being sold for a lot of money. But on the other hand, that's essential for fulfilling the goal that we outlined at the beginning of this panel, when we were talking about our materials being excluded from institutional archives, and as such, preventing people like us from doing research, at least within an institutional setting, in these spaces. So now that I've enjoyed a collection development line, purchasing line myself, I know what it's like on the other side to like have to search out these kinds of materials and to diversify our collections, actually do that kind of work. So on that level, I do appreciate the representation and kind of trickling in, but it really is jarring to see things that you grew up with, materials from your culture being at least framed in these elitist spaces, right? To see the realization of it. So there's a certain tension there, as I've articulated in some of the other questions, that I have to navigate, and have to sort of reckon with, as I operate in this brave new world.
Well, I would like to say that when you go to antiquarian book fairs and things of that nature, I am willing to wager that 80% of those books were at one time just trade books. It's just that they lasted and they became valuable, because you will find a lot of what I find when I go there, a lot of them are basic trade books, or basic autobiographies or biographies that were written for the general public, but they were written in 1920, and there's only 100 copies left. So suddenly it becomes extremely valuable. And some of those books are actually, cast off from public libraries, and they still have the marks of the public libraries in them. So that shows you that what we hold as common in our lifetime becomes extremely precious in years to come. So it's really interesting, what makes a rare book, what makes an important book. Mm-hmm. And it takes time and skill, and I will come back to this again and again. Institutions, whether they're educational, business, or whatever, museums, they need to invest more time and energy in the historically Black colleges, giving those students the opportunities to learn these skills, these professions, because this is where the bulk of Black America is being educated. And this is where, if you want to include Blacks into this rarefied air, you've got to go and get them. I jokingly tell people now that I don't go out and try to solicit, sales or anything of that nature, because none of my ancestors got on a boat, came across the Atlantic Ocean, found the HR department, knocked on the door and say, hey, can I get an application to be enslaved? No, the institutions here went to Africa and took my people. And if they had the gumptions to do that 300, 400 years ago, you should do it now. You should go and find us. We shouldn't have to say, hey, here we are. You should come to us and say, we have something to offer you that will make the world better.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this? This is a really, really important.
Mhm.
I'll weigh in, although I am not a moderator. I'm not a panelist, I'm a moderator. But you know, one thing that has entered my mind since I started thinking about special collections and how more African American things are available, and how I never thought I would be in special collections. I used to walk by rare book rooms, even when pursuing a PhD. That was the first time I ever entered one because I needed to, because the book I needed was there. That's the only reason, although I love the libraries. But, you know, it dawned on me that we have African-American traditions of what you may want to call rare books, but they're framed very differently. And the institutions such as Schomburg, you know, the Blockson Collection, other African, Howard, Moreland Spingarn, you know, they go back 100 years and more. And many African-American people see those sites as essential. I saw the Schomburg as essential to my identity because I discovered it in undergraduate school and never thought that was a rare book library. I didn't think of it like that. This is just a library where you can find out about Black materials. So I think, you know, what Amos is saying about HBCUs is very important. And part of what is tragic to me is that in many instances, HBCUs are priced out of the market that we see, you know, at these antiquarian book fairs. And a lot of times institutions have to rely on donations from communities, which they often have better relationships with. So that's a part of the picture too. We have a Black tradition of book collecting and of bibliophilia and so on, that is essential. And, you know, everybody could learn from that tradition.
Yeah, I want to say too, the largest collection outside of Schomburg Center, the largest collection I've seen of just African American culture in print was Joanna Banks, the woman Joanna Banks, who donated a very large percentage of her items to Penn Kislak Center, and going to see those items, Jet Magazine, Ebony, children's books, cookbooks, that was really an amazing experience for me finishing up my library degree. And I went to Howard for a year. I went to Morris Brown in Atlanta, and I think I'm seeing what you're saying, Curtis, and seeing how we are not thinking that certain materials are what we're thinking and what's being defined as rare, and the way that that we just see. I remember seeing Jet magazines on my grandma's kitchen table or a living room table going into her house, and not thinking that this is so important that it's something that needs to be held on to. And I'm wondering, just based on what y'all's responses have been, it sounds like really a community relationship needs to be built much stronger with the institutions, like Amos said, but the community, the Black community, really, we have to figure out other ways of sharing the importance of what these rare materials are, sharing a way of bringing that education and keeping it within our community, but also sharing that out as well, and from the household and from within the community.
If I could just quickly add that I think that the Clayton, the Mamie Clayton Collection and Library is a perfect example of sort of all the different factors that we're speaking, because that collection has resisted being absorbed by an institution, and in some ways to its advantage, because it maintains a certain level of autonomy that you would never get in an institutional setting, but in some ways to its detriment, in that the funding has always been an issue and it's just really expensive to not only to house the collection, but to process it, to catalog it, to make it accessible, and to run the programming and outreach that, you know, that is afforded to the kind of institutional support when collections are absorbed into the institution. So that's a dynamic we also have to factor in and consider.
Let's see.
5:45.
Yes, it is 5:45. Thank you guys so much for addressing the questions that we provided for y'all beforehand. Curtis and I are now going to look into the chat feature, and we're going to start getting some questions from our amazing audience that's been with us since 5 o'clock. And we're going to start asking some questions from here. But Jesse, I will say we have a question that because you did mention Mamie Clayton, that one of our audience members says that Clayton State Dominguez Hills has now has that collection. And that was something that happened within the last month.
Right, right, and I'm aware of that, but to my knowledge, it's like a hospitality situation to where they're housing the collection, but it's not, you know, sort of a part of the university, similar to the Amistad.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Okay, so we're going to go right in. Marilyn Thomas wants to thank everybody for their participation, wants to thank Amos for bringing HBCUs into this conversation. And when she has tried to put HBCUs at the forefront of conversations about the need for Black librarians, she has not received support from Black librarians. And typically there's a class aspect involved, as you did say, Amos. Thank you for pointing out that reality and the exclusiveness by which librarianship is seen. Do you all think that the rejection of Black print culture is the rejection of Black culture, or is it more about popular culture?
I think it's both. I think it's not just a rejection. I think in terms of Black print culture, you know, being something that should be studied or preserved, I think that has as much to do with who the print material is for, or who it's about in terms of the value of it. But I also think, you know, pop culture as a scholarly topic, you know, certainly more focused now. But I do think that, to Amos's point, in terms of, you know, kind of these elite circles, I think there's a resistance to admit, you know, as Jesse did, admit to liking urban lit, or to admit, you know, that you deal in popular culture or that you're interested in popular culture. But I also think there's a real prejudice towards thinking about what African Americans or Black people produce, but also what they can learn. Because what we've been talking about in terms of this, you know, like representation, not just of the print material, but of African Americans or Black people within the circles of collecting or library circles, has to do with, you know, I'm at a school where, but for the rare books school and my relationship to that and some of my colleagues, it would have never occurred to me to teach about book studies or the importance of a book within my classes. I teach about what's in the book, but to teach about the actual material object. And I think that, so that's something that I do, but I think that there are probably prejudices that keep people from thinking that that's an education for marginalized communities or for people of color.
We have a question here. I don't see the name, but it says that Dr. Erickson, Jesse, suggested Black print culture as an expansive concept. And it made this person think about Sarah Blackwood's claim that 19th century African-American Black visual culture resides, quote unquote, outside objects we typically see as historical evidence. The quote reads, "For Black writers, visual culture was not only a collection of material objects, it was also a process through which individuals came to understand the world and their place in it." And the question is, do you see Black print culture working in similar ways? And if so, how?
Absolutely. And the how, as I indicated earlier, is in the evidence of how it can be traced in all the various particular details, right? Um, right down to, I mean, I study a lot of 19th century, late 19th and early 20th century Black print culture, and something, you know, as obvious as the frontispiece that you would take for granted. Well, the representation of Blackness in a frontispiece is indicative of the racial politics of that particular period, right? There's arguments about respectability politics and racial uplift in the ways that we are portrayed in those frontispieces, right? Um, Oftentimes, if you go take it back even generations further back, to the late 18th century with Phyllis Wheatley's work and Jupiter Hammond, the statements of, you know, the prefatory statements of authenticity, right? The fact that Black authorship had to be validated, right, in the eyes of the white readership, right, in the audience, in terms of reader reception. All those details, right, that are embedded in the physicality of these objects tell a story. And what I think it's important to recognize, you know, whether it's you know, poetry or the Black arts movement or Black comic books, is that you have to pay attention to those details, because they're going to tell also a story about how we produce knowledge as a people, which is often different than the sort of hegemonic traditional ways of producing knowledge that come down to us in you know, in our curriculum, whether it's K through 12 or in higher learning. And I think that's sort of the final frontier for us to recognize, is that, you know, the sort of the modes of creating that knowledge itself can be divergent from those traditionally accepted modes. And, you know, I look at, you know, and I think Elizabeth McHenry, for instance, has done a lot of work in this area, the power of erasure, right, of that oral culture and oral tradition being in parallel and being in concert with the literacy practice, and taking that into consideration when we're looking at objects of Black print culture. So I think all of that has to be considered.
All right, Amos, would you like to share any comments?
I kind of got lost in a lot of different thoughts there. But I sincerely believe that it is only through diversity that the richness of humanity can come about. That we must always seek diversity. We must always be inclusive, because each individual has a gift to give to the larger society. It is up to us to help that individual discover that gift and to recognize that gift. And that is one of the things that I think has been missing for so many years in this civilization, that we assume only certain people have the gift, but the gift is everywhere. We can learn from everybody. We can learn extremely positive things from everybody if we embrace the fact that they have something of value to give us.
I'm gonna choose one more question from the chat, but kind of combining a couple that I'm seeing. One, how do we get young Black folks who are in their early career or in still LIS, still going to school for their LIS degree? How do you get young Black folks interested in this type of work in Black print culture? And the second question, I'm kind of bringing them together because of the age that we're in, but how do you all see the influence of the digital age on Black print culture at this moment? How has this changed Black archives, collecting, printing, etc.? Does digital culture change how we understand print materials? And so y'all can choose one of them, both of them, but it's kind of really the question is looking at what are we doing right now with the digital age that we're in, and how do we get folks who are in this age going back to school, LIS degrees? How do we get them to become interested in this Black print culture? And Bryn, I see that you've unmuted, so I'll let you start.
Yeah, no, I'll speak more to the digital because, you know, I was really struck, you know, by the sale of, well, that Ebony and Jet magazine now, just, they're defunct. And, you know, their popular Black magazine has gone to a digital form, which isn't, you know, which isn't keeping with a lot of magazines. But one of the things that gets lost in that, or that promotes among, I think, people of color, the idea that digital is the way to go. And what gets lost is the value of that print publication. And I've, you know, been seeing more and more, I guess, advertisements for this new magazine, Crown magazine, which is for, well, it's targeted towards women of color, and it's about their hair. And it is consciously a print product. You know, it says a print magazine for women of color, and it's beautiful and it's beautifully photographed. It's so expensive. You know, there's this tension, but it's printed as a print product, a material thing, in contrast to this digital age. But there's that tension between making something so special that the very market or the people that you would want to enjoy it can no longer have access to it. So I think in some ways, you know, and the same with Johnson Publishing, one of the things that I regret so much about how Johnson Publishing operated is that they kept what was so special secret. You know, they made it so hard for people to get access to their archives that, in a way, I think that contributed to its demise, because there wasn't a recognition of what that organization or that company meant historically or culturally, in a way that the stuff mattered, that the actual stuff mattered. So that's kind of all over, but those are thoughts that have been going through my mind even as we've been having these discussions. I think there has to be a push, an actual push towards producing print culture and popularizing it, but not at the same time. You can't make it something that is so special that, you know, only certain groups can participate in it.
I want to jump in and say that, at least in my perspective, I don't really see a stark contrast or a dichotomy dividing digital from print. My understanding is similar to, you know, how you would look at, you know, Incunabula in its infancy, as manuscript culture was deeply embedded in the print culture. I mean, you can't really, like, you know, cleanly separate them. And I just see there's so many examples of everyday lived experiences where print and digital are working together and all intermixed. And I think it's going to continue to be that way, you know, at least for the remainder of my lifetime, and most likely thereafter. But another thing is, I think that you know, Black cultural expression in particular is adept at what's been defined as, like, sort of Black techno cultures. We're really adept with technology and using technology in interesting ways that don't necessarily form a clean break with past you know, with past examples and past ways of you know, creating culture, right? So, you know, in that sense, I'm actually kind of optimistic about the way that things are, and I'm absolutely just fascinated with the landscape of both Black print culture and you know, the techno cultures that we encounter in our digital spaces. In terms of the connection to recruitment for LIS, I think you know, we definitely need to do a lot more work on that front. And I think that everything that I just talked about with respect to our relationship with both print culture and technology will help to create sort of archives and library and information practices that are in a sense Black centered, right? Kind of moving it away from the Eurocentric models. And I think that is more important than just, you know, checking off a diversity box, right? But to do that, it takes a lot more work than even just the recruitment aspect. it's even more work retention aspect, because then at that point you do actually have to listen to our ideas and help us bring them to fruition. So that's my little 2 cents on that really complex question, and I thank you all for it.
I'm going to jump in right here. Fortunately, we're at time. It's 6 o'clock right now, and if people want to hang out and talk a little bit more, that's a few minutes, maybe that's okay. But I'm going to thank everybody who joined us. Thank you to our presenters, our panelists for their wonderful and informative conversation. Thanks to everybody who attended. Thanks to all the RBS staff who helped us to bring this about and gave us technological support. I will very briefly say that I put my email in the chat. Anybody interested in LIS, as a career, feel free to contact me. I have information about, an encouragement for joining the profession, and I'm sure other panelists do as well, and Vanessa probably. So I don't have anything more to say. If you want to say anything, Vanessa.
I did want, I put my personal email in there too, just in case. But I did want to let Amos I know he wanted to say one last word. And again, for folks that do need to log off, we totally understand. I know that we are at time. I want Amos to kind of say what he had to say, and then we can leave it at that.
Well, I'm simply going to say that one of the byproducts of the digital age is that the younger generation are now able to make these zines, which is another whole literature that's coming out. And it is it is affordable. So I think that you will see that there will be more zines from Black people, zines from Indigenous, zines from brown people that will flood, not the market, but will flood the culture. And there will be some people that will start to collect them because they see them as a cultural marker.
I would say, I know we're over time. That's a really good point, Amos. I was at the New York Art Book Fair at PS1 in New York, and there's a lot more diverse representation at some of the art book fairs. Independent book producers, zine producers of all sorts, and are there, like you're saying, and we're starting to collect these materials because it's of our time, and it's much more accessible and available as well.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead. Thank y'all so much. The chat has been really lively. Y'all are asking really great questions to RBS, and continue to ask questions and see what more folks can do, what more institutions can do. Thank you so much, Jesse. Thank you so much, Brenna. Thank you so much, Amos, for joining us tonight. I hope that we can be in communication in the future. And everybody just breathe. And you guys enjoy the rest of your evenings. Take care, and y'all take care of yourselves and of your loved ones. And I do want to say hi, Mom, because I know she's watching me. And you guys have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.